It is the summer of 1972. The world is gripped by Cold War tension. In the skies above the Persian Gulf, Soviet reconnaissance jets are probing the edges of American influence, and somewhere beneath those skies, a king, a Shah, is sitting in his royal palace in Tehran, Iran, staring at photographs of the most powerful aircraft ever built by human hands. His name is Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, and the machine that has captured his imagination is a Grumman F-14 Tomcat, a supersonic, swing-wing, carrier-based fighter jet that America's most brilliant aerospace engineers had designed to be nearly impossible to defeat in the air. Before we are done today, you're going to understand exactly how and why this extraordinary weapon ended up in the hands of a nation that would, just a few years later, become one of America's greatest adversaries. And the story begins not with a battle, but with a handshake. It is January 14th, 1969, and inside the sprawling Grumman Aerospace Corporation facility in Bethpage, New York, engineers are working around the clock under fluorescent lights, surrounded by blueprints, empty coffee cups, and the electric smell of ambition. The U.S. Navy has issued a desperate requirement. They need a new interceptor fighter, something that could detect, track, and destroy up to 6 enemy aircraft simultaneously at ranges of over 100 miles. The threat driving this requirement is the Soviet Union's long-range anti-ship missiles, specifically the deadly Raduga P-15 and Newark H-22 cruise missiles launched from Soviet Tupolev-2, 22 backfire bombers. These bombers could, in theory, swarm a U.S. Navy carrier strike group with so many missiles that conventional fighters simply would not be able to respond fast enough. Grumman's lead engineer, Mike Pelahak, a sharp, intense man from Long Island who had spent 2 decades designing military aircraft, gathered his team in a war room and told them something that set the tone for everything that followed. He reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we are not building a fast airplane. We are building a survival machine for the fleet." That phrase, a survival machine for fleet, defined every design decision that followed. The aircraft that emerged from their labors would feature variable sweep wings, a 2-man crew, the most advanced radar in any tactical aircraft in the world, and the ability to fire the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, a weapon so sophisticated that it costs more per unit than a small house in suburban America. Here's something to think about. If the U.S. Navy needed this aircraft to survive Soviet attacks, why on earth would they sell it to a foreign nation? Keep watching. The answer involves one of the most complex geopolitical relationships of the 20th century. By the early 1970s, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi had been on the peacock throne for nearly 3 decades, and he was a man consumed by a single burning vision: to transform Iran into the dominant military power of the Persian Gulf region, and perhaps beyond. Born on October 26, 1919 in Tehran, the Shah had been educated partly in Switzerland, had survived assassination attempts, and had been briefly deposed before being restored to power in 1953 with significant covert assistance from the CIA and British intelligence, a fact that would haunt U.S.-Iran relations for decades. By 1972, Iran was awash in oil money. The global energy crisis had sent petroleum prices soaring, and Iran, sitting atop the 4th largest proven oil reserves in the world, was collecting revenue at a rate that astonished even optimistic economists. The Shah's finance minister, Hashang Ansari, later recalled, "The Shah did not see Iran's oil wealth as something to be saved. He saw it as a fuel for a rocket, and he intended to ride that rocket to the stars." With billions of petrodollars filling the national treasury, the Shah went shopping, and he went shopping for weapons the way other rulers went shopping for furniture. He wanted the best, the newest, the most lethal, and when he was shown classified footage of the F-14 Tomcat's first successful Phoenix missile intercept test on December 8, 1970, he reportedly stood up from his chair and said simply in Farsi, "That is what I want." The implications of that statement would reshape the geopolitics of the Middle East for the next 50 years. To understand why President Richard Nixon agreed to sell America's most advanced fighter jet to Iran, you have to understand a doctrine that has never fully left American foreign policy: the twin pillar strategy. It was the summer of 1972, and Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, a bespectacled, gravelly-voiced German-American strategist who believed that power, not principles, governed the world, had crafted a policy for the Persian Gulf that rested on two pillars, Saudi Arabia and Iran. If these two nations could be kept strong, well-armed, and pro-American, the argument went, then the United States would never need to deploy its own troops to defend the region. It was, in essence, a strategy of using local proxies to project American power without American blood. In May 1972, Nixon and Kissinger flew to Tehran for a meeting with the Shah at Niavaran Palace, an elegant, modernist complex set in the cool hills north of the Iranian capital. According to declassified State Department cables later released in 2000, Kissinger reportedly told the Shah at that meeting, "Your Majesty, we want you to be our partner in the Gulf, not just a customer, a partner." The Shah reportedly smiled and replied, "Then treat me like a partner. Show me the F-14. What happened next was, by any measure, extraordinary. Nixon agreed, without the usual congressional oversight, without the standard foreign military sale review process, and over the vocal objections of several senior Pentagon officials, to allow Iran to purchase not just a handful of the aircraft, but up to 80 F-14 Tomcats, along with the full supporting infrastructure, training programs, and a classified AIM-54 Phoenix missile system. The dollar figure attached to the deal, when fully accounting for spare parts, training, and logistics, would eventually approach $2 billion, making it one of the largest arms transfers in American history up to that point. While the geopolitical chess game was being played in Washington and Tehran, back in Bethpage, New York, the executives of Grumman Aerospace Corporation were facing a very different, very earthly crisis: bankruptcy. The F-14 program, for all its technological brilliance, had been an engineering and financial nightmare. The aircraft's Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engines were dangerously unreliable, so prone to compressor stalls during aggressive maneuvering that test pilots privately called them the engines that want to kill you. Development costs had ballooned far beyond original estimates, and the U.S. Navy, facing its own budget pressures in the post-Vietnam era, was threatening to reduce its orders significantly. Grumman CEO Lou Evans, a measured, silver-haired executive who had steered the company through difficult periods before, reportedly told his board in early 1973, "If the Navy cuts back any further, we will be forced into an orderly wind down. There is no pleasant way to say it. We need this Iranian contract to survive." And survive it would, because Iran's order, ultimately settled at 80 aircraft with options or more, injected hundreds of millions of dollars into Grumman's balance sheet at precisely the moment the company needed it most. Workers on the Tomcat production line, many of them from working-class Long Island families who had spent their entire careers at Grumman, felt a complex mixture of relief and unease. One longtime machinist, Donald Ferrara, who worked on the assembly of the Iranian Tomcats, later told an interviewer for an aviation history journal, "We were glad to keep our jobs. But there was something strange about building these planes for people you'd never met, in a country most of us couldn't find on a map without squinting." The Iranian deal did not merely save Grumman. It fundamentally changed what the F-14 Tomcat was. It was no longer just an American weapon. It was a global commodity with global consequences. Beginning in late 1974 and accelerating through 1975 and 1976, a select group of Imperial Iranian Air Force pilots began arriving at Naval Air Station Miramar in San Diego, California, the legendary base that would later be immortalized in the 1986 film Top Gun. These men were the cream of Iran's military aviation elite. Hand-picked officers, many of them educated at elite Iranian universities, many of them sons of wealthy families connected to the Shah's court, all of them burning with a patriotic desire to master the most sophisticated fighter on the planet. Leading the group of Iranian officers coordinating the transition was Brigadier General Mohammad Khatami, the Shah's brother-in-law and commander of the Imperial Iranian Air Force, a charismatic, aviator sunglasses-wearing figure who embodied the Shah's vision of Iran as a modern military superpower. Khatami arrived at Miramar on April 3, 1975, walked out to the flight line where a gleaming F-14 Tomcat sat in the California sun and reportedly placed his hand on the aircraft's nose. According to witnesses present that day, he said quietly, in heavily accented English, "She is beautiful, more beautiful than the photographs." The American instructors were initially skeptical. They had been told these would be competent pilots who needed advanced training. What they found, in many cases, were genuinely gifted aviators who picked up the Tomcat's complex systems with startling speed. One U.S. Navy instructor, Commander Jack Stewart, a veteran of 2 combat tours in Vietnam, later wrote in his memoir that the Iranian pilots were among the most motivated students I ever trained. Some of them had reflexes and situational awareness that I rarely saw even among the best American nuggets. The relationship between the American instructors and the Iranian students was, by all accounts, genuinely warm, a fact that would make the events of 1979 all the more painful. On August 12, 1976, at Mehrabad International Airport on the western edge of Tehran, a crowd of Imperial Iranian Air Force officers, government officials, foreign military attaches, and press photographers gathered on the tarmac in the blazing late summer heat. The temperature that day hovered near 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and the shimmer of the runway made everything look slightly unreal, which was fitting, because what was about to happen seemed almost unreal. 2 F-14 Tomcats, freshly painted in the Imperial Iranian Air Force's distinctive light gray livery and bearing the golden emblem of the Shahinshir, the lion and sun insignia of the Iranian Empire, came in low over the city in a thundering flyby that rattled windows for half a mile in every direction, then swung around in a graceful arc and touched down perfectly on the runway. The Shah himself was not present that day. He was attending to state business, but his personal representative, Air Force Commander General Khatami, stood at rigid attention on the tarmac as the aircraft taxied toward him. According to the Iranian newspaper Kayan, which covered the event on its front page the following morning under the headline, "Iran receives the world's most powerful fighter," Khatami said to the assembled crowd. "Today, the Islamic," he meant imperial skies of Iran, "are safer than they have ever been. Any enemy who dares to challenge us in the air will face the wrath of this magnificent machine." For the Shah, watching footage of the arrival that evening at Niavaran Palace, the moment represented the culmination of years of effort, hundreds of millions of dollars, and an unshakable belief that Iran's destiny was greatness. He did not know, could not have known, that within less than 3 years, everything he had built would be swept away by a revolution he had not seen coming. Through 1977 and into 1978, the Imperial Iranian Air Force's F-14 squadrons, designated the 81st and 82nd Tactical Fighter Squadrons, based at Khatami Air Base in Isfahan, Iran's ancient and culturally magnificent city of mosques and bridges located approximately 340 kilometers south of Tehran, began conducting operational training missions at an intense pace. The pilots who flew these aircraft were already experienced in American-built fighters, having previously operated F-4 Phantom IIs and F-5 Tiger IIs, but the Tomcat was in a different category entirely. It's a WG-9 radar, the most powerful and sophisticated airborne radar on any tactical aircraft in the world at that time, could track up to 24 targets simultaneously and engage 6 of them at once with the AIM-54 Phoenix missile. For Iranian pilots, the moment they first activated this radar during live exercises and watched the scope fill with data was, by many accounts, a genuinely emotional experience. Colonel Jalil Zandi, who would later become the highest-scoring F-14 ace in history with 11 confirmed aerial victories, described his first radar lock at range as like seeing for the first time. You realize that everything that came before, all the flying, all the training, was preparation for this moment. The aircraft also proved its value almost immediately in a strategic intelligence role. Its powerful cameras and sensors were used to conduct reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory near the Iranian border, missions that, declassified CIA records later confirmed, provided American intelligence analysts with imagery and electronic intelligence data that they could not have obtained any other way. The F-14 Tomcat, in Iranian hands, was already more than just a fighter. It was a strategic asset. If you're finding this story as jaw-dropping as we do, Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the most gripping military and political stories in modern history. Now, let's keep going. By the autumn of 1978, the mood in Tehran had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who had ruled Iran for 37 years and had transformed it, however brutally and unevenly, into a modern industrial state, was facing the greatest crisis of his reign. Mass protests, fueled by resentment of Western influence, economic inequality, the brutal tactics of his secret police Savak, and the electrifying voice of an elderly cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini broadcasting revolutionary sermons from exile in a Paris suburb called Nifl-e-Chateau, were shaking the foundations of the Peacock Throne. At Khatami Air Base in Isfahan, Iranian F-14 pilots were receiving increasingly confusing orders. Some squadron commanders loyal to the Shah were preparing their aircraft for potential internal security operations. Others, sympathetic to the revolutionaries, were quietly refusing to fly certain missions. The American military advisors still stationed at the base, approximately 800 U.S. military personnel, were working with the Iranian Air Force at that time, sensed a change in atmosphere acutely. One American technical advisor, Sergeant First Class Gary Owens, later described the mood at Khatami in October 1978 in a letter to his wife in Columbus, Ohio. "Something is different here. The Iranians I work with, the guys I've eaten lunch with for 2 years, the guys who taught me a few words of Farsi, they're not the same. Some of them look scared. Some of them look excited. I can't tell which is worse." The Shah, sick with cancer that he was concealing from almost everyone around him, was losing his grip, and with it, control of the most sophisticated air force in the non-NATO world. The date was January 16, 1979. It was a cold, overcast Tuesday morning in Tehran, and the streets were eerily quiet, the quiet of a city holding its breath. At Mehrabad Airport, the same airport where the F-14s had landed in triumph just 2.5 years earlier, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi stepped out of his limousine in a dark overcoat, walked across the tarmac surrounded by a small group of tearful aides and security personnel, and boarded an Iranian Air Force Boeing 707. He carried with him a small container of Iranian soil, a gesture that suggested, or perhaps hoped, that his departure was temporary. It was not. He would never return. As his aircraft lifted off the runway and climbed through the gray Tehran sky, crowds gathered in the streets below. Some were weeping. Many more were cheering. And within minutes, the cheering had turned into a roar that swept across the entire city. Horns honked. Fireworks went off despite the morning hour. Strangers embraced on street corners. The image of the Shah that had hung in shops and offices across Iran for decades began coming down with a speed that suggested many of those displaying it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Shah flew first to Egypt, then to Morocco, then to a series of countries that received him with decreasing warmth as it became clear that the Islamic Republic rising in Iran was not going to collapse under its own weight. At Khatami Air Base in Isfahan, when the news broke, Iranian pilots sat in the squadron ready room in near silence. Colonel Zandi later recalled, "Nobody said anything for a very long time. Then someone turned on the radio, and we heard the crowds, and we understood that everything had changed." On February 1st, 1979, exactly 16 days after the Shah's departure, a white Air France Boeing 747 touched down at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. On board was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the 76-year-old Islamic cleric who had spent 15 years in exile, mostly in Iraq and most recently in the quiet Paris suburb of Nifl-e-Chateau, where he had granted interviews to the global press and recorded the sermon cassettes that had circulated through Iran like wildfire. When Khomeini descended the stairs of that aircraft, he was greeted by a crowd estimated at between 3 and 5 million people, one of the largest gatherings of human beings in recorded history, who lined the streets from the airport to the capital, weeping, chanting, some of them fainting from emotion. A French journalist who witnessed the arrival later wrote that the atmosphere was not like a political event. It was like the second coming, if you believed in such things, and millions of Iranians clearly did. For the Iranian military, including the pilots and ground crews of the F-14 squadrons. Khomeini's return presented an agonizing choice: remain loyal to an institution, the Imperial Iranian Armed Forces, that had just lost its commander-in-chief, or align themselves with a revolution whose final shape was still unclear. Many senior officers were arrested in the coming days. Some were executed. Others fled. At Khatami Air Base, junior officers quietly removed their imperial insignia and waited to see what the new order would demand of them. The F-14 Tomcat sat in their hardened shelters, engines cold, systems dormant. The most powerful fighter aircraft outside of NATO, now in the hands of a government that had not yet decided what it wanted to do with them. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday, September 22nd, 1980, and in the Iraqi capital Baghdad, President Saddam Hussein sat in his presidential palace, surrounded by military advisors who had spent months convincing him that the time had come to strike. Iran, they argued, was in chaos. Its military had been gutted by the revolution. Thousands of officers purged, executed, or imprisoned. Its American weapons were degrading without spare parts. Its new government was isolated internationally, paralyzed by internal power struggles, and still holding 52 American hostages from a U.S. embassy seizure of November 1979. Iraq, by contrast, had Soviet military support, a battle-hardened army of 200,000 men, and a motivated air force equipped with MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and a formidable French-built Mirage F-1. Saddam Hussein looked at the map and saw opportunity. At 2:12 p.m. local time, Iraqi aircraft crossed the Iranian border in force, striking airfields including Mehrabad in Tehran, Dezful in Khuzestan, Tabriz in the northwest, and a dozen other military facilities. The attack was designed to be a decisive knockout blow, a repeat of Israel's stunning preemptive strike on Arab air forces in 1967. It failed spectacularly. Iranian air defense radar operators, many of them the same technicians who had trained on American systems under the Shah, tracked the incoming Iraqi aircraft and scrambled their own fighters with surprising speed. And within 48 hours of the war's opening shots, Iranian F-14 Tomcats were airborne over the battlespace, and they were hunting. The exact date is recorded in declassified Iranian Air Force records as September 24, 1980, just 2 days after the Iraqi invasion began. The location was the skies over Khuzestan province, the oil-rich southwestern corner of Iran, where Iraqi ground forces were already advancing rapidly toward the city of Khorramshahr. Flying one of the Iranian F-14s that morning was a young but experienced pilot whose identity Iranian sources have never fully confirmed, though aviation historians believe the kill may be attributable to Lieutenant Shahram Rostami, a graduate of the F-14 training program at Miramar. The Iraqi aircraft targeted that morning was a MiG-23BN ground attack variant, a capable Soviet-built machine, but one that was fundamentally outmatched the moment an F-14 WG-9 radar locked onto it from a range of over 80 miles. The AIM-54 Phoenix missile, the weapon that had so captivated the Shah when he first saw footage of its test firing, was not used in this engagement. The kill was accomplished with shorter-range AIM-7 Sparrow, but the psychological impact was immediate and profound. When news reached Khatami Air Base that a Tomcat had scored a kill in the war's opening days, the reaction among the pilots was described by later testimonies as electric. One ground crew chief, Sergeant Mohammad Reza, reportedly ran from the maintenance hangar to the pilot briefing room shouting, "She fights! She fights!" using the feminine pronoun that Persian speakers often apply to beloved machines. What that moment established, beyond tactical significance, was something almost spiritual for the Iranian aviators. The Tomcat was not just a machine they were maintaining against impossible odds. It was a weapon that, in their hands, still worked, still killed, still dominated the sky. By the spring of 1981, the Islamic Republic of Iran was facing a crisis that threatened to ground its entire F-14 fleet entirely. The aircraft had been designed by Grumman to be maintained with a constant supply of American-made spare parts, specialized tools, and factory-trained technical support. All of that had evaporated with the revolution. The Carter administration had imposed a comprehensive arms embargo on Iran in November 1979 following the hostage crisis, and the Reagan administration, which took office in January 1981, had initially shown no inclination to relax it, despite the fact that, as we would later learn from the Iran-Contra scandal, some elements within the Reagan administration were already exploring covert arms deals with Tehran. The Iranian Air Force's solution to the spare parts crisis was a masterpiece of improvisation, desperation, and ingenuity. First, Iran approached several intermediary nations, primarily Pakistan, Turkey, and interestingly North Korea, to source components through third-party channels. Second, Iranian engineers at the Iran Aircraft Industry Facility in Isfahan began reverse engineering critical components, a process that was painstaking, expensive, and only partially successful, but which demonstrated a level of technical sophistication that Western intelligence analysts consistently underestimated. Third, and most controversially, Iran ran covert procurement networks through front companies in Europe, particularly in West Germany, Switzerland, and Portugal, to acquire American military components that were theoretically under export control. One of the key figures in this network, an Iranian-born arms dealer named Cyrus Hashemi, who operated between London and New York, later became a central figure in congressional investigations into illegal arms transfers. The Americans were not merely passive victims of this circumvention. Evidence suggests that some U.S. defense contractors participated in or turned a blind eye to gray market sales of F-14 components, calculating that the revenue was worth the strategic risk. It was, in every sense of the term, a weapons deal that refused to stay dead. No discussion of the Iranian F-14 in the Iran-Iraq War is complete without giving full account of the man who became its greatest practitioner, a pilot whose combat record would, by the war's end, make him not just the most successful F-14 pilot in history, but one of the most successful fighter pilots of the entire post-World War II era. Colonel Jalil Zandi was born in 1947 in Tabriz, in northwestern Iran, and came to aviation to the Imperial Iranian Air Force's rigorous officer training program. He was elected for F-14 transition training in the mid-1970s and traveled to NAS Miramar, where American instructors noted his exceptional three-dimensional spatial reasoning and almost preternatural calm in the cockpit during high-stress training scenarios. One American instructor reportedly told his commanding officer after Zandi's first simulated combat sortie in the Tomcat, "This kid is going to be very good, maybe great." He was right. Between 1980 and 1988, Colonel Zandi flew combat missions against Iraqi aircraft almost continuously, racking up aerial victories against a range of Iraqi fighters, including MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-25s, Mirage F-1S, and Su-22s. His confirmed kill total of 11 aircraft made him the highest-scoring F-14 pilot in history. But numbers alone do not capture what made Zandi exceptional. Fellow pilots described a man who seemed to enter a different psychological state in the cockpit, fully focused, unhurried, speaking in clipped, precise radio communications that conveyed absolute command of his situation. After one particularly difficult engagement in 1982, in which he shot down 2 Iraqi MiG-23s in the same sortie, Zandi reportedly returned to base, climbed out of the cockpit, and sat quietly for several minutes before speaking to anyone. When asked by his wingman what he was thinking, he said, "I was thinking that my father wanted me to be a doctor. Today I think he would understand." Colonel Jalil Zandi died in September 2001, just days after the September 11 attacks in the United States, of a reported heart attack. He was 54 years old. If you're finding this story as jaw-dropping as we do, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, so you never miss our next deep dive into the most gripping military and political stories in modern history. Now, let's keep going. The city of Karamshar, located at the confluence of the Karun River and the Shat al-Arab waterway in southwestern Iran, was Iraq's primary strategic objective in the opening phase of the war. It was a vital port city, a symbol of Iranian sovereignty, and a gateway to the country's oil infrastructure. From September to November of 1980, Iraqi forces poured into Khorramshahr in the most intense urban combat the Middle East had seen since the Second World War. House to house, street to street, room to room fighting. The Iranians began calling it City of Blood, which was both metaphor and precise description. In the air above this bloodbath, the Iranian F-14 force played a role that was strategically decisive even if poorly documented in Western military histories. The Tomcats, operating from Khatami Air Base and occasionally from dispersed positions, were tasked with maintaining air superiority over the battle area, preventing Iraqi aircraft from providing close air support to their ground forces in the city. Iraqi pilots, aware of the F-14's AWG-9 radar and Phoenix missile capability, were deeply reluctant to enter Iranian airspace at any altitude where the Tomcat's radar could paint them. This created a de facto exclusion zone over the battle area that significantly limited Iraq's ability to use its air force as a tactical weapon. General Mohammad Farsi, a senior Iranian military commander, later noted in his wartime memoirs, the F-14 did not just shoot down enemy aircraft, it changed the behavior of enemy aircraft. And sometimes that is the more important thing. It was a lesson in deterrence that the aircraft designers had intended, but never imagined would be demonstrated in this particular war, in this particular sky. The AIM-54 Phoenix missile was, by the standards of 1970s technology, something close to science fiction made real. Weighing over 1,000 pounds and stretching more than 13 feet in length, the Phoenix carried a 135-pound high-explosive warhead and used a semi-active radar guidance system, combined with an onboard active radar seeker that allowed it to pursue targets at ranges that approached 100 nautical miles. In American service, the Phoenix was designed for one purpose: to shoot down Soviet cruise missiles and bombers before they could get close enough to launch their own weapons against a U.S. carrier battle group. In Iranian service during the Iran-Iraq War, it acquired a completely different tactical profile and a terrifying psychological reputation among Iraqi pilots that exceeded even its considerable physical capabilities. By early 1982, Iraqi Air Force commanders had received enough reports from surviving pilots about encounters with Iranian F-14s to develop a clear operational picture. Any mission that brought Iraqi aircraft into contested Iranian airspace risked engagement at ranges that left no reasonable chance of detection, reaction, or survival. A Phoenix missile, once fired, could pursue an evading target at speeds exceeding Mach 5. No aircraft of that era, not the MiG-25, the fastest aircraft in Iraqi service, and not the Mirage F-1, the most maneuverable, had a meaningful chance of outrunning it. The result was a transformation of Iraqi air strategy. Rather than fighting for air superiority over Iranian territory, Iraqi commanders began routing their strike aircraft around Iranian air defense coverage areas, adding hundreds of miles and precious fuel consumption to their missions and correspondingly reducing the weight of ordnance their aircraft could carry to target. The F-14 Tomcat was winning battles without firing a single shot, simply by existing, by being known to be there, by being, as one Iraqi Air Force general who defected to Jordan in 1985 reportedly told Western intelligence debriefers, the shadow that turned every mission into a gamble we were not willing to take. Here is where the story takes a turn that might seem too strange to be true if the documentary evidence were not so overwhelming and so thoroughly investigated. The year is 1985. The Iran-Iraq War has been grinding for 5 years. Hundreds of thousands are dead. Iran is under an American arms embargo. And yet, in the basement of the White House, a small group of National Security Council staff members led by Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a compact, intense Annapolis graduate who believed with religious fervor that the ends could justify the means, are conducting secret negotiations to sell American weapons to the Islamic Republic of Iran. The rationale, as far as it was a rational one, was threefold: to secure the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon by Iranian-backed Hezbollah, to fund, covertly and illegally, the Nicaraguan Contra rebels whose congressional funding had been cut off, and, according to some participants, to begin a strategic back-channel relationship with elements of the Iranian government who were believed to be more moderate than Khomeini's inner circle. The The weapons included TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk surface-to-air missile systems. But critically, Iranian negotiators also pressed for F-14 spare parts, specifically components for the aircraft WG-9 radar and TF-30 engines, and it is now documented through the Tower Commission report of 1987 and subsequent congressional investigations that some F-14 related components were included in the Iran-Contra transfers. The United States was, in secret, supplying the Air Force a nation it publicly described as a state-sponsored terrorism, extending the operational life of aircraft that were actively engaged in a shooting war in the Persian Gulf. As Senator John Kerry said in a 1987 Senate hearing on the matter, with barely contained fury, we have to ask ourselves, have we lost our minds, or have we just lost our principles? The answer, the evidence suggested, was that the two had become indistinguishable. As the Iran-Iraq War entered its middle years, grinding attritional, punctuated by mass infantry assaults that recalled the Western Front of World War I more than any modern military doctrine, the Iranian F-14 force continued to operate at a tempo that stunned outside observers. By any objective analysis, the aircraft should not have been airworthy in such numbers. Spare parts were scarce, sometimes unavailable entirely. The maintenance crews, many of them trained under the Shah, were working with improvised tools, locally fabricated components, and sheer ingenuity. By 1983, Western intelligence estimated that of the original 79 F-14s delivered to Iran, one was lost in an accident before the revolution. Perhaps 20 to 25 were airworthy at any given time. By 1985, some estimates put the operational number as low as 12. Yet those 12 or 15 or 20 continued to fly, continued to intercept, continued to enforce Iranian air superiority over the key sectors of the front. The maintenance miracle was largely the achievement of Iranian Air Force technicians working at the Iran Aircraft Industry Facility in Isfahan, where engineers had developed a program of cannibalizing unnervy aircraft for parts to keep others flying. This robbing Peter to pay Paul approach to fleet maintenance was not unique to Iran. It has been used by air forces from the Korean War to present day, but the scale and sophistication of the Iranian effort, given the circumstances, was genuinely remarkable. One American defense analyst who reviewed declassified CIA assessments of the Iranian F-14 fleet in the early 1990s told Aviation Week magazine, "We kept expecting them to collapse, and every year they didn't. Every year, those planes were still up there." The Iranian Air Force had taken America's most advanced fighter and turned its maintenance into a national act of will. Of all the aerial engagements fought during the Iran-Iraq War, none was more consistently dramatic than the contest between Iranian F-14 Tomcats and Iraqi Mirage F-1 fighters. The Mirage F-1, built by Dassault Aviation of France and supplied to Iraq from 1981 onward, was a superb aircraft, agile, reliable, equipped with capable radar and armed with the Magic close-range missile and the Super 530D medium-range missile. French military advisors helped train Iraqi pilots in its use, and the Iraqi Air Force considered its Mirage-equipped squadrons its elite strike force. French officials, for their part, took considerable commercial pride in their aircraft performance, a pride that was tested severely whenever a Mirage F-1 met an Iranian F-14. The dynamics of these engagements were, in most cases, heavily favorable to the Tomcat. The F-14's superior radar range meant that Iranian pilots were aware of approaching Mirages long before the Mirages were aware of the Tomcats. This asymmetry of information, the Tomcat pilot knowing precisely where his opponent was while remaining invisible himself, created an almost unfair tactical situation. Iraqi pilots who survived such engagements described a consistent experience. They would be flying a routine mission when suddenly a missile would appear in their field of vision from a direction they had not anticipated, and there would be almost no time to react. One Iraqi Mirage pilot who ejected safely after being engaged by what he believed was an F-14 in 1985 and was later treated at a Red Cross facility told a war correspondent, "I never saw the aircraft that fired at me. I only saw the sky and then the smoke from my own engine, and then I was in my ejection seat." That is not air combat. That is being hunted. It was exactly what the aircraft had been designed to do. The hunters, in this case, happened to be flying the aircraft that Nixon sold. On August 20th, 1988, the guns fell silent along the Iran-Iraq war front. UN Security Council Resolution 598, passed the previous year, had finally been accepted by both sides after Ayatollah Khomeini, in one of the most dramatic public admissions of defeat in modern history, described accepting the ceasefire as drinking a cup of poison. The 8-year war had killed an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people, wounded millions more, and destroyed the economies of both nations. In the immediate aftermath, military historians and intelligence analysts around the world began the grim accounting of what happened in the air above that conflict. The Iranian F-14 forces war record, when assembled from Iranian Air Force records, foreign intelligence assessments, and the account of surviving pilots, was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Iranian F-14s were credited with between 55 and 160 aerial victories during the war, depending on which source you consult and how strictly you define a confirmed kill. Even using the most conservative figures, the aircraft had demonstrated that it could remain combat effective under the most adverse maintenance and operational conditions imaginable. Colonel Zandi's personal kill total of 11 made him the world's top-scoring F-14 ace. The aircraft had outlasted its supplier's goodwill, its original government, an arms embargo, a revolution, and 8 years of continuous warfare. As for the American pilots who had once trained the Iranian aviators at Miramar, many of them followed the war's air campaign with complicated feelings. Commander Jack Stewart, the Vietnam veteran who had praised his Iranian students, told an interviewer years later, "I trained those guys. Some of them I genuinely liked. And then I watched them fight a war with a plane I helped them learn." You can't feel simple things about that. It's not a simple story. He was right. It was not a simple story. And it was not yet over. In the years immediately following the 1988 ceasefire, the Islamic Republic of Iran faced an air force in desperate need of reconstruction. The 8-year war had consumed enormous quantities of material, and the F-14 fleet, which had performed magnificently under the circumstances, was now at perhaps its lowest point in terms of airworthy numbers. Western intelligence estimates from 1989 and 1990 suggested that fewer than a dozen F-14s were capable of flight operations at any given time. The Iranian government, under President Hashemi Rafsanjani, a pragmatic cleric who replaced Khomeini's firebrand revolutionary ideology with a slightly more pragmatic approach to governance after the Ayatollah's death in June 1989, faced a strategic choice: abandon the Tomcat program entirely and replace it with Russian aircraft, or invest the resources necessary to bring the fleet back to full operational strength. Rafsanjani chose the latter, and the decision was driven by a cold strategic calculation. No available Russian aircraft offered the same combination of range, radar capability, and missile performance as the F-14. The MiG-29, which Russia was selling to Iran, was a superb close-in dogfighter but lacked the AWG-9's long-range detection and tracking capability. The Su-27, which offered greater range and capability, was not available for export to Iran at affordable prices. The Tomcat, for all the headaches of its maintenance, represented a capability that Iran could not simply replace by writing a check to Moscow. So Iran doubled down. The Iran Aircraft Industries facility in Isfahan expanded its reverse engineering program. New contracts were let to front companies in Europe and Asia for components acquisition. And the Islamic Republic's intelligence services began one of the most sustained covert procurement campaigns in the history of post-Cold War arms control evasion. As Iran's efforts to sustain and expand its F-14 capability became more apparent to American intelligence analysts through the early 1990s, the U.S. government's response evolved from passive embargo enforcement to active counterproliferation operations. The Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA, working with the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Export Administration, identified a list of the most critical F-14 components, parts whose scarcity was a primary limiting factor on Iranian Tomcat operations, and began constructing sting operations designed to intercept procurement attempts. The critical components list was classified, but declassified versions released after 2006 reveal that the most sought-after items included specific circuit cards for the AWG-9 radar's main processor, bearings for the TF-30 engine's high-pressure turbine stages, and actuator components for the aircraft's wing sweep mechanism. These were not items that could be purchased at a hardware store or fabricated on general-purpose machine tools. They required specialized manufacturing processes and raw materials that were effectively controlled at only a handful of production facilities worldwide, most of them in the United States. The U.S. government approach was elegant in its ruthlessness. Rather than simply guarding the stockpile, American intelligence allowed certain channels to remain open under surveillance, so that Iranian procurement agents could be identified, tracked, and sometimes arrested, while the information gathered revealed the scope and sophistication of Iran's global procurement network. It was, as one former Commerce Department official described it to journalist David Wise for the book The Spy Who Stayed Out in the Cold, the most expensive game of whack-a-mole in the history of arms control. Every time one procurement channel was closed, two more opened. The Iranian appetite for Tomcat parts was insatiable. Between 1990 and 2007, U.S. authorities mounted dozens of operations targeting Iranian F-14 procurement networks, resulting in numerous arrests, indictments, and convictions of individuals who had attempted to export controlled F-14 components to Iran in violation of the Arms Export Control Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Some of these cases were relatively minor. Small-scale opportunists who had found surplus F-14 parts at military surplus auctions and attempted to flip them for profit. Others were more significant. In 2007, federal prosecutors in California indicted a California-based arms dealer named Saifullah Parcha, no relation to the similarly named Pakistani man held at Guantanamo, along with associates, for attempting to broker the export of AWG-9 radar components to Iran through intermediaries. In another high-profile case in 2006, U.S. authorities arrested a Florida-based company's principals for attempting to ship F-14 titanium fairings to Iran via an intermediary in Singapore. But perhaps the most significant and revealing of these cases involved an undercover operation run jointly by the Defense Criminal Investigative Service and Homeland Security Investigations, in which agents posed as arms dealers willing to supply Iran with critical Tomcat components. The operation ran for nearly 3 years and penetrated deep enough into the Iranian procurement network that investigators were able to identify the specific Iranian Air Force units that were requesting the parts and, in some cases, the specific tail numbers of the aircraft they were intended to maintain. The operation culminated in 2005 with a series of arrests in the United States, Germany, and the United Arab Emirates. Senior American counterproliferation officials later described the Iranian procurement network as more sophisticated, more resilient, and more patient than any other network we have encountered with the exception of state-level nuclear procurement programs. That assessment itself was a kind of tribute to the determination of the people trying to keep the Tomcat flying. On September 22, 2006, coincidentally, the 26th anniversary of the Iraqi invasion of Iran, the United States Navy flew its final operational F-14 Tomcat sortie. The aircraft Bureau of Naval Aviation serial number 161159 was flown from Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia Beach, Virginia, to the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where it was placed on permanent display. The retirement was the end of an era in American military aviation, the passing of a machine that had defined naval air superiority for 33 years, and that had become, thanks largely to the film Top Gun, one of the most famous aircraft in popular culture. But the retirement of the American F-14 fleet carried consequences that extended far beyond nostalgia. The U.S. Navy had, for years, maintained careful control over F-14 spare parts, controlling their disposal and destruction as a direct counterproliferation measure intended to prevent parts from reaching Iran. Now, with the aircraft retired from American service, there was an enormous amount of surplus hardware to manage, Spare engines, radar components, avionics assemblies, airframe parts, tool sets, and technical documentation, representing billions of dollars in original acquisition cost. The disposal of this material became the subject of intense debate within the Pentagon and the intelligence community. Some argued for immediate destruction of all surplus components. Others pointed to the cost of destruction and argued that controlled sale to allied nations or disposition to the Defense Logistics Agency's normal surplus sales process was sufficient. The debate was resolved, ultimately, by a decision that was as remarkable as anything else in this story. And it came because of a discovery that changed everything. If you're finding this story as jaw-dropping as we do, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the most gripping military and political stories in modern history. Now, let's keep going. In early 2006, just months before the U.S. Navy F-14 retirement, investigators from the Government Accountability Office conducted an audit of how surplus F-14 parts were being handled through the Defense Logistics Agency's disposition process. What they found was deeply alarming. The GAO's report, released in June 2006 under the title DoD Surplus Sales, More Controls Needed to Prevent Unauthorized Transfer of Sensitive Parts, documented that a significant number of F-14 components, including items on the critical components list, have been sold to the DLA's surplus sales process to commercial buyers without adequate verification of end use. More alarming still, investigators found evidence suggesting that some of these commercially purchased components had subsequently made their way to overseas buyers. The GAO's lead investigator, Gregory Cutts, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee on July 11, 2006, that undercover agents posing as parts buyers have been able to purchase numerous controlled F-14 components through online surplus sales channels without encountering any meaningful resistance. The Washington Post reported on the findings under a headline that captured the essential absurdity of the situation. Pentagon parts for sale. Iran could be buying. The reaction in Washington was, in the understated language of government, significant concern. The reaction in Tehran, if anyone in Tehran's Air Force supply chain was reading the American press, which they certainly were, was likely something closer to professional satisfaction. The system designed to deny them parts had been, at least partially, circumventing itself. The response to the GAO report was swift and, in its own way, historic. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, a man not generally known for historical sentimentality about machinery, signed off on a directive in September 2006 ordering that all surplus F-14 components held in the U.S. government inventory that could not be immediately verified as demilitarized be physically destroyed. The destruction program that followed was both necessary and genuinely painful for many of the people who carried it out. At Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, the legendary Boneyard, where the U.S. military stores and eventually disposes of retired aircraft, Tomcat airframes that had once been the pride of American naval aviation were crushed, cut, and shredded. Avionics components were destroyed with industrial sledgehammers and grinding equipment. Even technical manuals and engineering documentation were incinerated. Aviation historians and museum curators who had hoped to preserve more complete examples of the aircraft for future generations watched in frustration as pieces of irreplaceable aerospace history were reduced to scrap. One curator from the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, who asked not to be identified, told Aviation Week, "What we are watching is a deliberate erasure, a chapter in American aerospace history. It is necessary, perhaps, but it is also a kind of tragedy." The reason for this extraordinary measure was simple. America could not trust its own supply chain. The Tomcat had become so thoroughly entangled with Iran, so completely bound up in a web of covert sales, sting operations, embargo evasion, and bureaucratic failure, that the only way to guarantee parts would not reach Tehran was to ensure there were no parts left to sell. The aircraft that Nixon sold had, in a very real sense, become more of a strategic headache for America than for Iran. As of the time of this narration, the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force maintains a small number of F-14 Tomcats in its active inventory. The exact number is a subject of considerable disagreement among intelligence analysts, with estimates ranging from a low of 8 to a high of 44. Iranian state media periodically releases footage of F-14s in flight, typically during military exercises or air shows, as a deliberate signal of the country's continued ability to operate the aircraft and, implicitly, a symbol of defiance toward the United States. In February 2023, Iranian media released footage of what appeared to be two F-14 Tomcats flying in formation over the Persian Gulf during a military exercise named Great Prophet 17. Western analysts who examined the footage noted that the aircraft appeared fully airworthy and that their external ordnance stations appeared to be configured for operational missions rather than simple display. How many of these aircraft are truly mission capable? That is, able to fly a full combat mission with operational radar and weapon systems, remains genuinely uncertain. The AWG-9 radar in particular is known to have been extremely difficult to maintain, and several aviation analysts believe that most operational Iranian Tomcats are flying with substantially degraded or locally modified radar systems that represent perhaps 40 to 60% of the original capability. But even degraded capability in an aircraft as fundamentally powerful as the F-14 represents a serious tactical asset. And there is this to consider. Iran has never, in over 40 years of operating this aircraft under the most adverse conditions imaginable, fully stopped flying it. That in itself is a statement about the aircraft, about Iran, and about the enduring, complicated legacy of one of the most consequential arms deals in the history of modern warfare. Step back from the details, the dates, the names, the technical specifications, the covert operations, and ask yourself the fundamental question: what does this story actually mean? On one level, it is a story of a weapons deal gone catastrophically wrong. The United States sold its most advanced fighter aircraft to a government that collapsed within 5 years, and that aircraft then passed to a regime that America spent the next 4 decades opposing, arming against, and sanctioning. The F-14 deal was, from a pure counterproliferation standpoint, one of the most significant intelligence and policy failures of the Cold War era. But the story is more complicated than that narrative of failure. The deal was made under a specific set of geopolitical circumstances: the Cold War, the Twin Pillars Doctrine, Nixon's Realpolitik, that made it at the time appear rational and even strategically sound. The Shah of Iran was, by the standards of the region, a relatively stable and pro-Western leader. The Soviet threat in the Gulf was real. Grumman needed the revenue to survive. The conditions that made the deal seem reasonable were, within a few years, completely transformed by events: the Iranian Revolution, that almost no one in Washington or Tehran had adequately anticipated. Henry Kissinger, who had helped engineer the deal, was asked about it in an interview decades later and said, with characteristic deflection, "In policy, you judge decisions by the information available at the time they are made, not by the information that becomes available later." In 1972, the Iranian deal appeared sound. History did not cooperate with our expectations. That sentence, "History did not cooperate with our expectations," might serve as the epitaph for a great many Cold War policies. But it does not fully account for the human cost of those expectations, or the consequences that outlasted the men who made the decisions. We want to hear from you. Do you think the United States was right to sell the F-14 to Iran in 1972? Given what was known at the time, not what we know now, was it a reasonable decision? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's have a real conversation about it. Behind every major arms deal, behind every geopolitical decision, behind every square mile of airspace contested by competing fighter aircraft, there are human beings whose lives are shaped in ways they did not choose and could not have predicted. The Iranian pilots who trained at Miramar in the mid-1970s, who ate in American cafeterias, who learned from American instructors, who perhaps attended 4th of July cookouts and watched American baseball games and formed friendships with people they would never see again after 1979. These men went home and flew combat missions and died in wars, or survived wars, or were purged by revolutionary committees, or fled into exile. The American instructors who trained them Men like Commander Jack Stewart, who praised his Iranian student skill and then watched them use that skill in a war against an American armed enemy, lived with the complicated knowledge that their professional gift had rippled outward in directions they could not have foreseen. The Grumman workers in Bethpage, New York, who built the Iranian Tomcats on the production line, whose jobs were saved by the Iranian contract. Some of them surely thought, in later years, about the fact that the aircraft they assembled were still flying over the Persian Gulf, maintained by people they had never met, carrying weapons bought from companies that no longer existed, in service of a government whose ideology would have horrified the Shah. They had originally built those aircraft for Colonel Jalil Zandi, who became history's greatest Tomcat ace, died in 2001 without ever receiving the international recognition that his aerial achievement might have earned him in a different context. He was, by most accounts, a gifted pilot and a serious officer who happened to find himself in the right aircraft at the right moment in history. And the Iranian ground crews, the unsung heroes of the story, who kept those aircraft flying through sanctions and shortages and improvisation and sheer stubbornness, deserve acknowledgement not as adversaries or threats, but as human beings who were, in the most essential sense, just trying to do their jobs under impossible circumstances. The Grumman F-14 Tomcat was retired from the United States Navy in September 2006. It was replaced by the Boeing F divided by a -18E divided by F Super Hornet, a capable, flexible, and thoroughly modern aircraft that lacks, its admirers will grudgingly concede, something of the Tomcat's raw, almost theatrical power. The F-14 had a presence, a scale, a visual drama that made it unlike any other aircraft of its era. When it swept its wings forward for takeoff and unfolded that enormous, variable geometry silhouette against the sky, it looked like exactly what it was. A machine built not merely to fly, but to dominate, to intimidate, to declare without ambiguity that the sky belonged to whoever was flying it. In Iran, where as of this recording a small number of F-14s continue to fly, the aircraft has taken on a significance that transcends its tactical value. It is a symbol of Iran's technological capacity, of the Islamic Republic's defiance of international pressure, of the complexity and irony of the relationship between America and the nation that was once, not so very long ago, its closest ally in the Persian Gulf. In America, the Tomcat lives in popular memory primarily through the film Top Gun, through the photographs of carrier operations, and through the devotion of the aviation enthusiasts who regard it as perhaps the greatest fighter aircraft of the Cold War era. But its truest legacy is more complicated and more instructive than any of those images suggest. The F-14 Tomcat story is a story about the limits of geopolitical calculation, about the persistence of weapons once they enter the world, about the unintended consequences of decisions made by powerful men in rooms far from skies where those decisions ultimately play out. It is a story that should be taught in every foreign policy and arms control classroom in the world. And it is a story, as we hope we have shown you today, that is far from over. If you're finding this story as jaw-dropping as we do, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the most gripping military and political stories in modern history. Now, let's keep going.